Me Too points out the connection between behaviors like being a thoughtless sexual partner and, harassing and raping women, or making unwanted comments and then making unwanted advances. And I think we can trust women not to conflate those two things.
Hey everybody, it is Thursday, May 3rd, 2018, and I'm your host, Taylor Carr. You're listening to the Armchair Atheism podcast, the official podcast of godlesshaven.com. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/godlesshaven, and our Twitter handle is @godlesshaven. If you enjoy the show, please drop by the iTunes page and give us a rating or review to help spread the word. Feedback is always appreciated. So this episode is going to be a little stylistically different from some of the others. In the past, I've tried to structure each one around answering a particular question. This format works well for some topics, and not so well for others. I've found myself occasionally putting too much thought into what questions I want to ask, and some of the interviews I've enjoyed the most so far have been the most open-ended ones. So I think I'm just going to forgo that initial idea in order to maybe, hopefully, put out more episodes. I'm also about to have more free time soon, since I've actually just finished my last year of college as an undergrad. Yay! Finally! I don't know if that means the title of this podcast is inaccurate now or what, because of the armchair thing. Haha, get it? But it probably does mean you'll hear more excitement in my voice, for this episode at least. And I hope that also did not mean that I talked too much, because it's so nice to be done for now. I do plan on continuing my education, though for right now a break is in order, and I would like to use some of this time to do more of this sort of thing. Speaking of which, this episode came together pretty spontaneously after I read an article by the author, Caroline Mattis, covering Me Too, New Atheism, and the Men's Rights movement. Most of this interview centers around that article, which I do highly recommend you read before or after listening to this episode. It's short yet informative, not to mention very relevant to some of what has been going on recently, both in and outside the atheist community. And with that said, allow me to introduce my guest. Caroline Mattis is currently a doctoral student in the Religion in the Americas subfield at Princeton University. She is also the news editor and social media manager at the Harvard Religious Literacy Project. She is a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, where her work focused on contemporary American religious groups' media use. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, generally I like to have my guests tell me and the audience a little bit about themselves and their background, sort of what has gotten them interested in the sorts of areas of expertise that they've gone into. So maybe you can kick things off a little bit by telling us about some of that.
Sure. Well, I was raised in a conservative, evangelical, non-denominational church. So from an early age, it was really clear to me the kind of power that religion has in people's lives, the power it has to determine how they vote, how they organize their lives, how they raise their children, how they think about their studies, how they think about their relationships. So as I got older, I, kind of took my faith into my own hands. And when I went off to college, just kind of naturally fell into the religion department, studying the Bible for what it meant to me, as that kind of changed as I grew into adulthood, but also thinking about religion from more of a sociological perspective, thinking about how religious people change their minds, how religious people engage in the world, and also what it means to be a non-religious person, and how kind of a lack of religion, so to speak, also orders someone's world. So that's what originally got me interested in studying religion. And then it just kind of snowballed. I couldn't stop. So I went on to get my Master's of Divinity at Harvard, and here I am at Princeton in the Religion in the Americas subfield, studying a little bit of everything related to contemporary American religions and American non-believers, but especially how religious and non-religious groups use media sources to espouse their beliefs.
Well, that sounds like a very topical interest for religious studies, too.
Indeed, it gets me in trouble all the time.
So, out of curiosity, I've found this interesting because my minor is in religious studies, but other people I've talked to have how have your beliefs or your own, I guess, the way that you would identify your position, has that changed any since you've been studying religion at the academic level?
Definitely, yes. Um, well, I come from a tradition that believes that the Bible is, wholly inspired by God and inerrant. And as soon as I started studying the Bible in an academic setting, it became clear to me that I did not believe that and really couldn't justify that kind of belief. And evangelicalism really is kind of an all or nothing faith. Like you either buy the whole thing or it all falls apart. And so I spent a few years in college just trying to deconstruct a lot of the things that I had been told about faith and figuring out what I really believe. And I'm still kind of in that decompression period of just deconstructing a lot of beliefs from my childhood and not really holding to any one particular faith tradition at the moment. But I don't feel very bothered by my current agnosticism. I'm sure it'll pan out into something, or I'll just stay agnostic my whole life, and that will be just fine too.
Sure. It's funny that you mentioned that because I actually come from kind of a conservative evangelical background myself, and some of the stuff that I've been studying on this, especially in the wake of the 2016 election, has kind of made me feel a little bit like this doesn't seem a whole lot like the evangelicalism I remember being raised with. But then once you learn like how broad this group is and the different ways that that's kind of divided up by race and region of the country and stuff like that, I mean, this is kind of one of the things that makes the religious studies student in me kind of really fascinated with that, I guess.
Absolutely, yes.
So, what inspired your interest in New Atheism and its relationship to issues revolving around gender? Kind of one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot on this podcast is an article that you've written for Religion Dispatches called How Men's Rights Activists Are Finding Unlikely Allies in New Atheism, Me Too, the Manosphere, and the Church of Feminism, which sounds like a great book title.
And I really need to work on shorter titles. um, yeah, I guess in the course of trying to figure out my own religious identity, I listened to some new atheist podcasts and read a few books by new atheists, just to kind of see what was out there. And it didn't really appeal to me, and I didn't really think much about why that was. But I also, in addition to studying religion, I have done a lot of work in women's studies, and out of that grew an interest in masculinity studies, which is kind of based on women's studies values, but thinks about how different masculinities are constructed, and it just really the topics of new atheism and masculinity really dovetail to me. And as someone who is interested in online cultures, I found myself drawn to these Reddit cultures where, new atheist men and men's rights activists were increasingly kind of becoming one cohesive group. And so after just kind of falling down that rabbit hole for several years, I decided that it was something I should also start writing about.
Well, there's an interesting kind of intersection there, too, because I don't know if I can say I'm lucky enough to have been an atheist about the time that New Atheism really exploded, but I mean, I kind of, I don't know if deconverted is the right word, but started changing my beliefs and views on all that stuff right about 2007 when all this was like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all that was blowing up. And one of the things that I think often kind of gets a little bit, in some circles it's talked about more than in others, but one of the things that often does get left out of the conversation is New Atheism had a huge internet component to it, especially with like communities like YouTube, where to an extent it's still very active, and where YouTube also has a whole lot that you might call some of the men's rights stuff going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for a movement that does have really defined leadership in the form of kind of charismatic leaders like Richard Dawkins, there's also a strong kind of ground up force in new atheism that has taken off primarily in places like YouTube and Reddit that are democratic in terms of, who can join in the conversation.
Mm. So the article that you've written talks about some things that I'm sure listeners may already be like, huh, what are they talking about? Like the manosphere, men's rights activists, and red pill. So maybe to start things off, could you give a brief synopsis of these terms and kind of what you've learned about the movements that are behind them and the research that you've done?
Sure. So all of these communities seem to be kind of interwoven. So I'm not totally sure if there's a difference in terms of, do all red pillars identify as men's rights activists, et cetera. There isn't a lot of good, qualitative and quantitative research looking into that. But men's rights activists basically are men who feel like men in America are actually the oppressed group, and they are oppressed by not only the demands of feminism, but also just by women in general. That men are losing jobs, they're not, they're losing opportunities to gain custody of their children. They are being circumcised. So basically, they just point to a lot of trends in the United States that they see as being emasculating and dehumanizing to men. And the red pill takes its name from the movie The Matrix, in which, you can choose to take a red pill that will wake you up to kind of the behind the scenes that controls society. And so these men that participate in red pill communities see themselves as having taken the red pill and woken up to the fact that feminism is a lie, that society has bought into, that men are supposed to just accept their so-called dehumanization and emasculation. So, and all of these communities together are informally called the manosphere, just as a way of kind of lumping them together.
So where does atheism then fit into things here? Because one of the things that you mentioned that's really kind of fascinating is a survey that Stephanie, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, Stephanie Svan, I think, she wrote about this back in 2014 and found out some relatively surprising details, I guess I would say, about some of the users in the men's rights subreddit.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with online communities where people's identities aren't verified and such is that it's really hard to get a good poll to get a sense of how old are these people generally, what is their income level, what is their religious affiliation. So the MRA subreddit took it upon themselves to conduct kind of an internal poll, and that poll found that just a staggering number of the men who responded to the poll, at least, identified as non-religious or atheist. And so, I mean, I think that says something. We obviously have to take those results with a grain of salt because, the people who chose to take the poll might not be representative of all the people in the group. We don't really know what kinds of data collection techniques the people on Reddit who created the poll were using. But I mean, I've just found anecdotally that there are a lot of people who participate in conversations with kind of the four horsemen of new atheism that identify as men's rights activists or kind of bring up those concerns. And alternatively, on the men's rights activists subreddit, on red pill YouTube channels and such, a lot of those individuals do identify as atheist. So there seems to be a really strong connection between the two communities. And that was something that I wanted to dig into a little bit more.
It is kind of funny because when you think of some of the stuff that the red pill and the men's rights activists seem to be talking about, you usually hear that kind of rhetoric like the Handmaid's Tale sort of rhetoric from like religious conservatives, and then to hear that coming from some who pride themselves on being free thinkers and being rational and all this stuff is kind of, I think a lot of people, especially more recently, are kind of feeling a little bit shocked by some of this. And I think maybe that's partly because, it's not something that strikes some people as intuitive, maybe. But then the other side of that coin is there are women in the atheist movement who have been saying for years that they've felt uncomfortable because of some of the things that have sort of been coming out more recently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's been at least a low key problem in the community for really since its inception in the early 2000s.
So one of the things I'd like to talk a bit about, too, is this essay by Claire Berlinski that you mentioned Sam Harris shared on Twitter. Because Berlinski and Harris both suggest the Me Too movement has sort of given way to moral panic. And at least to my understanding, it seems their primary argument is that there's harm that's being done to men's reputations here. And from your article, I got the sense that you see this position itself as maybe indicating a kind of connection between new atheism and the manosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I have a lot of thoughts about that essay and also about kind of the Four Horsemen's promotion of that essay. Lawrence Krauss also tweeted that article out.
Interesting. I hadn't heard that.
So, I mean, first and foremost, talking about Me Too as a moral panic or about it as a hysteria, like hysteria itself is a gendered term. It means womb suffering. It's often been attributed to women. And I think just in general, painting Me Too as this mass hysteria contributes to a narrative of women going overboard and getting too emotional. And I think that Berlinski, especially at the beginning of her article, is trying to make a call for nuance and say, look, there is a difference between, say, Aziz Ansari being a bad or thoughtless sexual partner and Harvey Weinstein actually allegedly harassing and raping women. And I think that what it comes down to is like, do we trust women to be nuanced purveyors of justice in these conversations? Do we trust women to see that nuance? And I do. And I think that most women who are applauding and participating in the Me Too movement, trust women to be nuanced about that. And I think that so far that has proven to be the case. Me Too points out the connection between behaviors like being a thoughtless sexual partner and, harassing and raping women or making unwanted comments and then making unwanted advances. And I think we can trust women not to conflate those two things. So to go on to, what I think ties Berlinski's claims and the New Atheist Horsemen's, enjoyment of the article or appreciation of the article and men's rights movements is comments from Berlinski's article like, it now only takes one accusation to destroy a man's life. There's this sense of men being this beleaguered victim. And I guess a question to that is, since when? Like, we've seen very little come of these accusations. And these men, meanwhile, that are being called out are quietly getting their lives and their fame handed back to them. There was a Vanity Fair article, I think last week, saying Matt Lauer is planning his comeback. And then too, Berlinski as a woman is saying, when men in a professional setting come on to her, she is amused and flattered, and she doesn't give them that power. She allows herself to feel like she has power over them. And I think that what that suggests to me is that Berlinski and maybe others that are critiquing the Me Too movement have decided that being harassed is an acceptable price women pay for learning from brilliant male minds. And obviously she's entitled to that opinion, but I don't think that's the opinion of most women. And I think that that's a really toxic idea to normalize, that if a man is smart enough or powerful enough or helpful enough to your career, it's worth letting him grab your ass. And the fact is that she says she gets power from knowing that she could destroy them, and now she has too much power knowing that she really could destroy their lives. And the fact is, she couldn't destroy them. Almost all of the harassers in our lives will never receive retribution of any kind, either socially or professionally or legally. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this language that seems to intend to make these badly behaving men seem like aberrations or bad apples, rather than interrogating the broader social context that facilitates and encourages the spectrum of behavior in boys and men, is really dovetailing with what's happening in the men's rights movement. That would say, that would kind of ignore the cultural connections that keep men above reproach.
I'm glad that you said that too about the kind of longevity that some of this carries on with. It doesn't seem like men's reputations are really as drastically on the line. That kind of almost seems like panic coming from the other side there, because if you look at just like Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, there are so many examples of men who have carried on with this kind of behavior for decades. And now that this is just kind of coming to light and there's actually things that are being done about it, we're worried about the small number of men who might be falsely accused. And there's research that's been done out there to show that, as I'm sure you're well aware, that false accusations on these things are no more prevalent than they are with false accusations on any other kinds of reported crimes. And
Exactly.
at least to me, it kind of also, with the whole call for nuance, it's like, well, wait a second. You guys are comparing this to like witch hunts and to the communist Red Scare and stuff like that, when you had witches who, I think it's safe to say most atheists don't think witches are real. And then communists, one of the central things there was, communist sympathizers, where even sympathies would be enough. But in this case, we have like actual assault and harassment and rape accusations that we're talking about. It's not like just having an attitude that seems favorable to this or something, or practicing witchcraft, it seems to me. So talk about nuance with the kind of comparisons that keep getting made here.
Yeah, and I think that there's kind of this underlying sense of like, well, is what these men did really that bad? And I mean, part of that has to do with how we talk about sexual assault. We call it unwanted sexual contact, which unwanted sexual contact isn't sex, it's rape, and just like all the euphemisms that we use to kind of couch what really happens to women and men that are abused by people in power. And I think that question, that implicit and sometimes explicit question of, is it really that bad, makes us think, well, maybe they shouldn't lose their job. Maybe they should just get a slap on the hand. And frankly, people who cannot keep themselves from making unwanted advances on their students or on their employees should have their careers ruined. As long as men continue to behave in that manner, by no means should they be employed by a university. And I think that that's what it comes down to. I think that they should have their careers ruined. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But speaking of Lawrence Krauss, like was brought up a minute ago, it was only like a couple of weeks, actually, after your article was published that BuzzFeed story broke. And then more recently, David Silverman was fired from American Atheists, partly over accusations of sexual misconduct, partly over financial issues, which strangely seems to get just ignored in these conversations. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the reactions to these allegations, if you've been following much of what's been going on since then.
Yeah, I have been following them. It's disheartening, mostly, especially the Lawrence Krauss stories. I think that it's that tale as old as time of authorities being informed and largely not acting. I think that the Case Western Reserve was maybe the one university that did something right in terms of immediately listening to the student, banning him from campus. But yeah, I think that in general, we see the fruits of cultural conversations that say, well, unwanted touching, unwanted comments, it's not that bad. We see universities kind of responding in that same way, either putting someone on paid leave as they investigate, or just saying, don't do that again. You could end up getting in trouble. It's disheartening for sure. In terms of David Silverman getting fired from his position with the American Atheists, I mean, I'm skeptical. I think that he was fired over both these allegations of sexual misconduct and also financial conflicts of interest. And I'd be curious to see what would have happened if it had just been allegations of sexual misconduct. So we'll see. I remain pretty skeptical, so to speak, about how much change is actually happening. But certainly it's good that we're having more conversations about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I was going to ask that too was how did you specifically feel like American Atheists as an organization, how their reaction was to this? Because I know that I think they put out a press statement after this. I didn't read it, honestly, but I know also firing Dave Silverman in light of this, I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on maybe the difference here between the reaction of the atheist community as like a movement versus, these types of activist atheist organizations, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read their statement, but I think that it says something good that institutions are holding these men responsible to some extent as this stuff comes to light. And I think that, part of what makes an institution or an organization a little bit different from just kind of a cohort of atheist individuals is that they purportedly have, stated group values. And when someone, working for that organization goes against those values, then, they have those values to point to and say like, yeah, this, he broke our trust. He, went outside of the bounds of what we see as acceptable behavior. And for that reason, we have fired him. So that, I mean, that's useful. It's good that we have institutions for that reason alone.
So another one of the almost prescient parts of your article is a quote that you provide from a red pillar who says in response to Me Too that backlash is coming. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's hard not to think of this now in light of the Toronto attack by Alec Minassian, I think is how his last name is pronounced. Mm-hmm. Does this tell us that we should be taking more seriously the kinds of threats that are made in some of these online men's groups?
In short, yes. I think that women have long taken those groups seriously. And it's important and frankly belated that men in power are starting now to talk about men's rights activist rhetoric and beliefs as good indicators of future violent behavior, because that has long been a real connection. And it's good that we're talking about it more for sure. I think that it's clear to me that violent language and violent actions are all part of the same spectrum. Of course, I know which I would prefer. If men's rights activists want to sit around spewing hatred on Reddit all day, I'm not too bothered by that. But of course, some of the men writing and reading that vitriol are the people who will eventually or might have already escalated to physical violence toward female partners or female strangers. And the existence of communities like this, it's not inconsequential to violence perpetuated against women. So, I think that ultimately what we should take most seriously is any construction of masculinity that involves thinking that women owe men sex. And that's something that has been talked about a lot in light of that Toronto attack, because he's part of this incel group, involuntary celibates, that rage against women's refusal to have sex with them. And I think that points to a broader socially acceptable trend that includes language that we often deem innocuous, like talking about women friend zoning men. Like that kind of language suggests that by not wanting a sexual relationship, women are denying something to men that men are somehow inherently owed. And it's easy to see, to me, how this kind of thinking spirals out of control in the mind of a man who is sad and lonely and dealing with mental illness. And it's incredibly toxic. I think the only thing that will really change that culture is addressing the problem at its roots, which I think would require nothing less than just a complete overhaul of our gender relations. So it would take a lot.
And you sound very optimistic of that with the current administration that we have right now. But not to imply it's just the administration, because it's certainly much more than that, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what often frustrates people about, you know, feminists, radical feminists, women's studies folks, is this sense of like, oh, they're mad about everything. Like they get annoyed at everything. And I think that the reason that feminism gets that reputation is because, true radical change does involve changing the little things that we do. The little ways that we mark differences between boys and girls, even in the womb, having gender reveal parties that say like tanks or tutus or whatever. And it's like, why are little baby fetus boys associated with tanks? And so obviously some of that stuff is more innocuous than others, but I think that we need to be thinking in really broad terms about what we deem as acceptable behavior and thought patterns and speech from men and women alike.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of the parts of your article that I went and had to read the original comments made by Sam Harris on some of these things, because I think there's often this kind of attitude among some atheists that, oh, sure, he didn't really mean that. But what I'm talking about is he talks about why. I think the question he was answering was why there's so many men in the atheist movement and not more women. And his answer was basically that it seemed to be that there's something inherently male about rationality. Or perhaps, as he put it, that there's just not that extra estrogen vibe to atheism and rationality. That just kind of boggles the mind a little bit, because the other thing that I'm thinking reading that stuff is, well, maybe it's also comments like these that are part of the problem. It couldn't. His argument didn't seem to be so much of an argument as much as just kind of an assertion, though. But
he even says something in that same interview. He jokes that it's his lack of sex appeal that keeps women away from the movement, and that too is tied to this really ugly, toxic idea that like women opt in or opt out of things based on sex, that women are constantly choosing things based on sex, that if women are drawn to like a male leader or an educator, it's because they secretly want to have sex with him. And that's just simply not true. And I think that bubbles up in ways that are becoming increasingly obvious. USA Today was talking about the Toronto attacker, and they were talking about how, let me just look this up. Yeah, there was a guy responding to the attack saying, when a woman stops texting him back, I send them a message saying, Ted Bundy was a pretty cool guy. I wish it was legal to rape and murder women. I mean, I'd rather make them upset and fearful than just let them fade out and forget me and treat me like some subhuman. So what we're seeing there is this entitlement even to have women talk to them, and like women participating in a movement, women participating in an intellectual conversation still has this sexual undertone, in a way that's like so bizarre. and I think what it comes down to, as I've already said, but don't mind saying again, is that like women don't owe men their time or their love or their bodies or even their consideration. Like if a woman doesn't want to talk to a man or be his friend or have sex with him or be part of his movement, that is 100% her right. And there can be no wiggle room on this. And yet, because culturally we allow so much wiggle room on that, some men get just really twisted ideas that women choosing not to be their friend or be involved in their movement is offensive to the point of being dehumanizing to them.
And that's the part that I guess, I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I've always been good at this. I still think there's a lot of ways that I'm not, and that I need to learn things and develop as a man and as a human being and stuff. But there's just something about that to me that's also just kind of like, if we pride ourselves on being free thinkers and rational, however we identify, not just atheists, but agnostics, religious believers, there's a certain extent to which like that kind of thinking seems to me very similar to the kind of thinking that says, oh, so you don't believe in my God, so why do you hate God?
Mm-hmm.
It's this just kind of, it's this weird, just huge leap in logic that you can also see that that kind of has an anger behind it too. And I feel like atheists are just kind of kidding themselves if they think like this isn't something to worry about and be concerned with, just as well as, hey, we say that, religion is a non-real thing that we should be opposed to because of the harm that it causes. Well, here's something that I would say is unrealistic thinking that also causes harm, and that is arguably causing a lot more harm right now than some of these other religious beliefs that people identify with. But that also brings up another thing that brings up another thing that was interesting, that you drew this connection between rationality and the atheist denouncement of religion in your article, which was about how Richard Dawkins compares feminists to Islamists, and the manosphere refers to the Church of Feminism. And this kind of seems like the sort of labeling that's just often substituted for dialogue and debate, where just sort of calling something a religion in these circles makes it irrational. End of story.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. And that's kind of the crux of my argument here. The fact that so many guys showing up in the manosphere happen to be atheists isn't quite as interesting to me as the way that the manosphere has really taken on new atheism's rhetoric and vice versa. I mean, you see people in kind of both communities using language like the Church of Feminism. And it does seem like a shorthand for calling women irrational, which has a really long history, as you might know. And I think that, I think that this is a moment to be troubling rationality as a basis for unbelief altogether. So to kind of take this further, I like to say it this way, which is that atheists and agnostics and religious people all believe in a number of things every day that we know are not true, in things that we know are not true, and things that we know are true, and things that we hope are true. I live every day as if criminally underpaid workers didn't make the clothes that I wear, but I know that they do. I know that that's not true. Religious and non-religious folks alike wake up every day so confident that we don't even think about it, believing that gravity will work the same way today as it did yesterday because we know that gravity is true. And there are plenty of other things that we hope are true, from believing that, say, a loving being guides the universe, to believing that a bad thing that happened in my life was for a reason, to believing that things will work out okay for you or for your kids. So, aside from its historical use to marginalize women, the concept of rationality itself, I think, just bears scrutiny in light of how much we as human beings rely on this kind of magical mix of guessing and hope and knowledge. Like, there are things that we can know through science. That's absolutely true, but that's not the end of the story. So I guess I would love to see atheists and agnostics engaging in a really non-defensive, open, thoughtful, creative conversation about that, about what it means to live as a human being in a universe with just so many unanswered and potentially unanswerable questions.
Yeah, that's a great point, because that seems like one of the things that, at least for my part, that drew me to sort of like the atheist community, was this whole idea of exploring, no, there are other ways to live that don't have to do with kind of Christian theism and stuff. Mm-hmm. But I also kind of wonder, one of the things that I notice about some of these comparisons, like feminists to Islamists and the Church of Feminism and stuff like that, is that they just collapse any kind of diversity into these things, as if all feminists are one particular type of feminists, or all Muslims are going to be a terrorist or something like that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit to that, about the different kinds of feminism that are out there, and maybe what this also says about the way that atheists approach religion, because I do think that's one of the big problems. Is, on the one hand, we don't want to just sweep everything under the rug, I think, and say that all religion is good, but then we also don't want to just treat all religion as if it's any one thing when there's different forms of it. And I think that that's also worth pointing out when people have these ideas of like feminists are all feminazis and stuff like that. It's just, I don't see that as true, and I think partly that comes from a misunderstanding of what feminism is, maybe.
For sure. I mean, I think that terms like feminazi and creating what seems like a monolithic face of feminism or a monolithic face of Islam is inherently anti-rational because it's about rhetorically creating an enemy that you can hate on, and creating something to fear, creating something to increase your own, in-group identification as an atheist. And I think that, yeah, in terms of the manosphere's opposition to feminism, I don't know that any real they would ever be on board with any real type of feminism that I know.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I think that parsing out like different feminist commitments and stuff like doesn't really make a difference for the manosphere. Nor do I really think it makes a huge difference for new atheists. Just because, I mean, sure, feminism is about, achieving parity in some ways with men, like wage equality and stuff like that. But it's also about achieving equity, which means, taking a really good look at, how women and people of color are systematically disadvantaged in this country and thinking about proactive ways to fight against that. Whether that means, reparations for slavery and Reconstruction or, I don't know. I mean, I think that it involves a strong ethic of equality and a well thought out set of values, to be, an intersectional feminist, and values that are based in kind of a rational desire for all humans to thrive, but are also about more than that. So yeah, I don't know that New Atheism has done a really good job embracing intersectional feminism as a monolith. But then again, of course, there are individuals within the New Atheist movement that have gotten really fed up with the rhetoric of the leaders and some of the followers and have stepped out and made a name for themselves and gone a different way. So it's not like New Atheism is inherently incompatible with feminist values. I would say the manosphere is inherently incompatible with feminist values.
This kind of feeds well then into another question, which I guess is kind of, solutions always seem like, in a lot of ways, the hardest part of some of these conversations. So do you think that, like, we've talked a little bit about rationality, and to my mind at least, although to a lot of others too, there's this kind of traditionalist patriarchal conception of rationality as if like man is a rational animal. Well, that just kind of says it all right there, doesn't it? Right. But do you think like moving away from this kind of thinking is an effective way that atheists in particular might try and disentangle themselves from this kind of misogyny embodied in men's rights groups? And in addition to this, what are maybe some other ways of getting clear on, as you put it, ideological commitments in your piece? Because it does seem like we certainly have to move to real kinds of activism and doing more than just making sure that, the way we think about it in our heads is correct. We also have to like do things, especially talking with the other men in our life. I think that's one of the things that men fail to do so often because we're afraid that other men are going to judge us for that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's kind of a two-part question. I'm going to make sure that I answer both parts. Yeah, I think that the history of the term rationality itself and just the history of skeptical analysis of rationality or skeptical use of the term rational bears scrutiny in and of itself. And that's like a fruitful endeavor for atheists to undertake. And I think an exciting one, an opportunity for really creative thinking that can expand conversations about what it means to be a free thinker, what it means to be an atheist, what it means to be a skeptic, and what it means to be a rational being. We kind of, especially people in the new atheist movement, kind of use that term rational without really digging into what they mean when they say that. And that lack of thoughtfulness is what contributes to men's rights groups and red pillars saying like, oh, men are inherently rational, women are incapable of rational thought. That simplification of rationality into something that a man can do. It's like, well, what do you even mean by rational? So I don't see it as a stumbling block to new atheist or skeptic communities at all to have conferences and open conversations, ongoing dialogue about what we mean when we say rational. And is that a really good foundational word or concept for like what we create atheist communities around? And I think that just starting with seeing that as an opportunity rather than a setback is a good start. So to move to the second part of your question about getting clear on ideological commitments, I think that in some ways that goes back to what I said about institutions, because there are a lot of kind of prominent atheist organizations and institutions. And I think that, like, in part, they just need to get clear on their tangible ideological commitments. Like, a good place to start would be to have a robust, foundational, and explicit commitment to anti-sexism, anti-racism, anti-homophobia. So institutional commitment to those values is important because when issues like the Lawrence Krauss stuff comes up, leaders can point to those values and move forward based on them and say, we fired him because he violated those values. So, I mean, the benefit of that also is that, similar to using rational without really digging into what it means, when someone like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins calls himself a feminist, that's an empty term. Like, we don't have much to go on in terms of what that means for them. And thus, they're really not accountable to any particular set of values or behaviors. So having institutions that have a fleshed out stance on sexism, for example, keeps people like Sam Harris, but also like the many followers that might think of themselves as feminists but hold, deeply anti-feminist views from being able to just kind of haphazardly state their feminist identity as a way of defending themselves while not actually living out the values of robust intersectional feminism.
Well, then, maybe you can tell us a little bit about any of the work that you're currently focused on, and is there anything that you have coming up sort of down the pipeline?
Well, I am still working on atheism and red pill communities that overlap, so definitely keep an eye out.
Is there going to be a book or anything that comes out of that? Because it sounds like it would be very fascinating reading.
Potentially. For now, small scale, I would say keep an eye out on my Twitter for new articles that might come out this summer. My Twitter handle is @CarolineMattis. Mattis is spelled Matas. And I'll be presenting a longer paper on that same topic at the annual American Academy of Religion conference next fall. And hopefully we'll publish some longer papers about it soon. So my goal is to make all of that stuff as accessible as possible, which I'll primarily do through social media and stuff. In addition to that, I also do a lot of research on evangelicalism and evangelical media usage, which may or may not be interesting to people who are part of the atheist community. But yeah, in addition to all of that, I would say feel free to check out the Harvard Religious Literacy Project for my news coverage on issues pertaining to atheism and humanism and more. So I can be found tweeting there at Harvard RLP.
All right, well, very cool. It sounds like a lot to look forward to. And just for my audience, I'm going to put links also to your essay that we've discussed, as well as your Twitter and some other things on the page on Godless Haven, my website, where this will be posted as well. Okay. But Caroline, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really appreciated our discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
All right. Well, you have a good one then.
You too.
I'd like to thank Caroline for coming on the show. If you'd like to find out more about her or check out any of her work, links are available in the description for this episode at godlesshaven.com. At godlesshaven.com, you can also find out more about the show, more about myself, and plenty of additional content. Music in the show is my own work.